Welcome to an Introduction to Lateral Work, a lecture by Max Goodman. I am a trainee teacher in the École de Légèreté. I'm also a USDF bronze medalist and head trainer at Lake of the Woods Sport Horses in Warrenton, North Carolina. Feel free to contact me at the following addresses for more information. What is a lateral movement or lateral work? It's any movement where the horse is traveling on more than two tracks with a lateral bend. Lateral movements can be executed with more or less lateral flexion and more or less angle, creating 3 or 4 tracks. These aspects are dictated by the needs of the horse and the purpose of the individual exercise. For example, leg yielding is not considered a lateral movement because it doesn't include bend, but half pass, which also follows a diagonal path of travel, would qualify because it does include lateral flexion. Why do we do lateral work? Why do we practice lateral movements? Lateral movements help the horse to engage and collect one side of the body at a time. They also create lengthening of stride and suppling throughout the body. They can help address balance through correcting asymmetry and rebalancing the horse longitudinally. That means from front to back. What are the prerequisites before we start to learn lateral movements? The horse must understand the basic aids, including neck rein and independent leg and seat aids. A horse that can travel in a straight line with a clear lateral flexion without losing their balance. In Légèreté, we call this exercise fléchi droit. The horse must be able to turn in the opposite direction of the lateral flexion. We consider this neck rein turning or counter bend turning. All of these are really important because if you don't have these basics established, when you start to go to combine effects of the aids in lateral work, it will be really confusing for the horse and could lead to a bit of a battle because the horse will choose whichever aid it prefers to listen to. What are the lateral movements that we train? They are shoulder in, renvers, and for future reference for this lecture, these brown lines are indicating the wall or the side of the arena. Travers and half pass. Shoulder in and counter shoulder in are a 3 or 4 track movement where the haunch is sliding along the wall and there's a clear interior flexion. Renvers, the haunch slides along the wall, but the horse is also flexed to the outside. Travers, the head and shoulder are sliding along the wall, but the haunch is traveling to the inside. And in half pass, the horse is uniformly bent in the direction of travel and traveling on a diagonal line at a greater or lesser degree of angle. A few quick words about how we cue for lateral movements. This will be somewhat controversial because the way that we use our aids in lateral work is really dependent on the tradition that you study in. In Légèreté, we ground our weight in the direction of travel because if you've ever carried a weighted load, for example, a small child on your shoulders or back, you will know that it's much easier to move with the load than against the load. We do not push with the seat. We use our weight as an aid to denote the direction of travel, but we don't push the horse in any particular direction. We use lifting aids to ask for lateral flexion, as we have done earlier in the training, so for our horses this is reasonable. We use the leg inside the bend as if it is a pillar. In the old classical schools, lateral movements and other movements were taught around fixed posts. So the inside leg generally acts as a pillar. The outside leg will drop back from the hip, which supports the axial rotation of the rib cage and allows the horse to use its spine curvature. Because the rib cage is there, remember that the spine is not really able to bend as much in the thoracic or lumbar area as it would in the neck or tail. So the leg outside the bend is really supporting the rotation of the spine rather than a uniform bend throughout the body of a horse, which is not physically possible. In lateral movements, as much as possible, we'll use the position to denote the lateral movement and not an active aid. So we're looking for what we call in Légèreté descente de main, a clear release, often to make sure that the horse is executing the movement in self-carriage. So we're not going to pin the horse between these aids. We're going to sort of set the position, and then we're going to maintain it with our own position, which matches the horse. So in these diagrams, the weight aids are labeled in the brown color. For example, in shoulder in, the weight is going to be to the outside, and here you can see the outside leg dropped back to support the bend. The rider's position is denoted by this sort of blue-gray color, and then the active leg is going to be the one that is got this black border. So in this case, in shoulder in, the leg that would be active more likely than not is the inside leg. However, in renvers here, it's more likely that the outside leg is going to be active. So hopefully, if you pause here and consider these diagrams, it's a little bit more clear. But there's not a great way to illustrate this without actually riding it. So hopefully as we go through this presentation, it will make more sense. Is there an order to introducing lateral movements in training? I think that really depends on who you ask, but with some variations depending on the needs and balance of your horse, generally introduce the lateral movements in order from least to most difficult for the horse. But what makes a lateral movement difficult? Generally, whether it is something that the horse does naturally and where their weight is carried. If you are curious which limb or limbs are carrying the weight in a lateral movement, imagine the movement pivoting around a single point, like when we reduce travers down to a pirouette, for example. The limb that is at the point where the pivot is happening, the limb that is pivoted around, is bearing the most weight. So in the travers and pirouette example, it's the inside hind leg. In general, we are going to start with shoulder in and counter shoulder in, because they follow nature's design. A horse by nature carries 60% of her weight on her shoulders. In shoulder in, one shoulder or the other helps to bear the weight, along with a corresponding hind leg. Simultaneously, when turning in nature, the horse looks at something, causing alarm or curiosity, turns head and neck towards it, and then pivots away. Imagine a horse dodging a bull in a bullfight for a good example of this tactic. Shoulder in on 3 tracks has the added benefit of moving the hind leg that is inside the bend in line with the foreleg that is outside the bend. This diagonalization helps the hind leg engage under the horse and rider and bear weight, but never without the support of its partner foreleg. For the first time in training, except in reinback or jumping for the horse, the hind leg begins to engage and the upper limb, including the hip, stifle, and hock, begins to flex. This is one of the reasons why Nuno Oliveira famously called shoulder in the aspirin of all lateral movements. Shoulder in on the circle is often the most logical place to start. The circle creates the lateral flexion the horse will need for the movement, and then the rider can introduce yielding the haunch to the outside of the circle a few steps at a time. This gives the horse the balance and trajectory of shoulder in and uses the cues the horse already knows, yielding the haunch to the isolated leg aid and following the rider's weight to the outside of the circle. When the horse is able to easily do an entire circle in shoulder in, you can move your circle to one corner of the arena and then travel up the long wall, or spiral out from a central circle until you end up traveling along the rail. Shoulder in on a straight line is slightly more challenging for the rider, as the rider must now also maintain the lateral flexion that prior to the circle or figure was helping to ensure. You can see here in my diagram, the outside foreleg and inside hind leg are basically following the track of the circle. The inside foreleg and outside hind leg are displaced. So inside foreleg is coming to the inside of the circle, the outside hind leg to the outside. Counter shoulder in, like shoulder in, can be invaluable as a starting place. So in counter shoulder in, the movement is exactly the same, but the horse is traveling along the wall, bent toward the wall, rather than bent away from the wall. The shoulders are closer to the wall, the haunches are closer to the inside of the arena. Some horses have a strong tendency to rush or else proceed off the wall toward the center of the arena if they misunderstand the lateral movement going straight. Counter shoulder in takes the same physical requirement as shoulder in, but is done with the plane of the horse's face along the wall, horse bent to the outside, and the haunches to the inside of the arena. The wall helps to contain the horse so that the path of travel doesn't become a challenge to explain for the rider. Counter shoulder in on a circle is also very valuable for the horse to learn because it places weight on the hind leg inside the circle, outside the bend, but allows it to split the load with the corresponding foreleg. This can be excellent preparation for the next movements, which will progressively load the hind legs more and more. Next we have renvers, from the same root word as reverse. Renvers means haunches out. So the horse is traveling with the tail and haunch to the outside, but is simultaneously bent to the outside. So the nose is not going to slide along the wall as if the horse is a banana with the nose and the tail touching the wall at the same time. The nose doesn't slide along the wall, but because of the lateral flexion and angle, travels parallel to it, as here, in a small distance off the wall. Textbook renvers, unlike shoulder in or counter shoulder in, is typically practiced on 4 tracks. Renvers adds the challenge of traveling in the direction of bend for the first time in our progression. Renvers can be a huge help for horses that drop onto the inside shoulder on turns or push through the sternum. It also greatly elongates the reach of the hind leg. Identical mechanically to renvers on the straight line is travers. Travers, from the same root word as traverse, means haunches in. So here's our wall, our haunches are traveling to the inside. If you did travers or renvers in the field, the horse wouldn't know which movement you were doing without the reference point of the wall. All we would know is the direction of lateral flexion. So in fact, in this image, I'm doing travers or potentially renvers on the center line. So I'm using it to illustrate travers, but you can see that depending on where the wall would be placed, it would determine whether this is travers or renvers. Where renvers and travers diverge is on a circle or curved line. Renvers, when practiced on a circle, shifts more weight to the foreleg inside the circle and outside of the bend, and creates greater reach of the hind limb. Travers, however, on the circle creates significantly more engagement. In walk and in canter, travers has a moment where the hind leg inside the bend is supporting the mass of the horse independently. Horses must be properly strengthened through the prior lateral progression to prepare for these movements. Reduced to a single point, travers on the circle becomes a pirouette. The last lateral movement horses learn is half pass. Though not as physically demanding as travers on the circle, half pass is destabilizing and requires more management from the rider, without the benefit of the wall or a figure to guide the horse. All 4 of the horse's legs cross, particularly in moments of suspension. Half pass is a movement we do not generally see in nature, given the horse is moving in the direction of the lateral flexion. Half pass is a great test of lightness to the aids and self-carriage. It must not be performed with shoulders nor haunches leading, but both in alignment. This approaches the unstable balance discussed by masters like Boucher. Now, of course, lateral movements don't exist in a vacuum. So we can vary our lateral movements depending on the needs of the horse. One of the great ways that you can play with this variation is to correct asymmetry, whether from nature or in rehabilitation from an injury. We can train lateral movements differently in one direction than the other. First, consider a horse that is naturally contracted to the right. This horse will carry his head slightly to the inside, to the right, and his right hind slightly to the inside of his path of travel. Therefore, movements that increase lateral flexion to the left, engagement of the right hind, and abduction of the left hind will help to straighten the horse. If we consider how best to use the lateral movements to help this horse, we might practice shoulder in to the left with minimal angle and clear lateral flexion. However, on the right, we might use a greater angle and less flexion. This way, on the left, we get the greatest extension of the right-hand side outside of the lateral flexion, and at the same time maintain some engagement of the right hind as we are on a limited angle, even though it is the outermost limb. To the right, we increase the reach of the left hind and engagement of the right hind, and we minimize the bend to avoid the natural tendency of overloading the left shoulder or bulging the base of the neck, given the horse's natural asymmetry. With each horse I train, I approach the lateral work with their individual balance, tendencies, and needs in mind. In this way, I can use the lateral movements as a gymnastic, not just as a trick or photo op to tick a box. This is their true purpose. I hope you found this presentation helpful. If you have any questions, my inbox is always open. I am available for lessons in clinics locally, as well as in-house training, and virtual lessons across the globe as my schedule allows. Until we meet again, enjoy your lateral work.